This video is for anyone studying the poem Futility by Wilfred Owen. In terms of subject matter, I'm working on the assumption that this poem is about a soldier who has died during World War I. The speaker in the poem is dealing with the aftermath of a comrade's death. Today, when servicemen and women are killed abroad, we have repatriation ceremonies for them. However, in World War I, this simply wasn't possible due to the high numbers of deaths and the poor infrastructure. Remember that on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, an estimated 20,000 British soldiers were killed. So you might be able to argue that the soldier killed in this poem is receiving quite a lot of personal care compared to some of the soldiers who would have died in the war. In terms of form, we can see straight away that there are 14 lines in this poem that makes us think of a sonnet. Some people would argue that this isn't a sonnet because it contains 2 stanzas and its rhythm isn't tetrameter or pentameter. However, I'd argue that Wilfred Owen was a very careful poet and would have chosen his form very deliberately. He would have been very aware that he was writing in 14 lines and would have been aware that it would have looked a bit like a sonnet. Why, however, has he chosen to use an unconventional sonnet? Perhaps it's because of the subject matter. Remember that a sonnet usually answers a question at the end in its final 2 lines. The question that's answered here is simply that the speaker in the poem has lost all hope and that war is futile. Perhaps Wilfred Owen was trying to make a point about using the form of a traditional love poem that answers questions and subverting it for the subject matter of this poem. In terms of structure, the first stanza is much more optimistic than the second. This is reflected in some of the language that's used. In the first stanza, the language is very gentle, the word gently at the opening of the second line. Morning, rouse him. Very gentle sounds, lots of sibilants in the first stanza, which I think opens with a very gentle tone. And there's lots of hope that the sun will be able to wake him up. In the second stanza, we fall into despair. The speaker asks lots of questions, and we have the exclamation, "Oh." As I said before, in a sonnet, usually a question or a problem is posed, and this is answered at the end. In this poem, the question or the problem is, can we wake up this soldier? Can the sun give new life? And the answer that we receive at the end of the poem is no, and what's the point? In terms of language, there's lots we can say, but I'll just focus on a few points. The opening word is an imperative verb, move. Move him into the sun. From this, we could infer that the speaker is a person of authority, perhaps an officer. We could also infer from this and the rest of the poem that the speaker cares about the dead soldier. Perhaps he knows him. And the rest of the poem confirms this because the speaker knows that at home he used to lie in the sun. Secondly, we could look at the personification of the sun and the juxtaposition of how the sun is personified in the first stanza and the second. In the first stanza, the sun is described as kind and old. In the second stanza, however, the sun is described as fatuous, silly, and juvenile. Think about the tone of the poem changing from the way that the speaker feels about the sun in the first stanza to the way he feels about the sun in the second stanza, and how this reflects his feelings about the world in general.